All right, everybody, we're ready for part 4. I'm going to try to get 2 hours of this out of the way tonight. If you want to just skip to the start of the book, it will always be the pinned comment timestamp. All right, here we go. Let's put the book up there. Make sure all the audio is good. Good. Okay. Switch to the book. Looks good. Start recording in GarageBand. Okay. 1, 2, 3, and go. 1.2.7 The Pending Götterdämmerung. Underlying the rising geopolitical tension is a big economic reality. Karl Marx published his magnum opus in 1867. It was a very lengthy work of economic research called Capital. The text was intended as Volume 1, with other volumes published after his death. The pages of Marx's Capital explain the basics of how an economy based on profit works. Chapters describe profits, surplus value, commodities, and how their value is derived, and other key Marxist concepts. The climax of the text is chapter 25, when Marx describes the general law of capitalist accumulation. Marx describes how the capitalist is constantly looking to expand profits so that these profits can be reinvested into expanding production and making greater profits to then be invested again. In the process of doing this, the capitalist aims to drive wages down in order to maximize profits. The capitalist is also looking to hire as few workers as possible, further reducing costs and eliminating jobs with technology. The result of what Marx described as workers competing with machines is a growing reserve army of labor, i.e., unemployed workers whose labor is not being exploited for profits. Marx referred to the ever-growing mass of unemployed workers as the reserve army of labor. The more people that are unemployed, the lower the wages, as competition for jobs is more intensified. As Marx had explained in his earlier book, The Poverty of Philosophy, from day to day it thus becomes clear that the production relations in which the bourgeoisie moves have not a simple uniform character. But a dual character, that in the self-same relations in which wealth is produced, poverty is produced also. That in the self-same relations in which there is a development of productive forces, there is also a force producing repression. That their relations produce bourgeois wealth, i.e., the wealth of the bourgeois class, only by continually annihilating the wealth of the individual members of this class and by producing an ever-growing proletariat. The great physicist Albert Einstein was deeply inspired by Marx's explanation of the problems of capitalist economics. Einstein reiterated Marx's concepts in his own words in an essay called Why Socialism, published in 1949. Explaining Marx's analysis, Einstein wrote, "Production is carried on for profit, not for use. There is no provision that all those able and willing to work will always be in a position to find employment. An army of unemployed almost always exists. The worker is constantly in fear of losing his job. Since unemployed and poorly paid workers do not provide a profitable market, the production of consumers' goods is restricted, and great hardship is the consequence. Technological progress frequently results in more unemployment rather than an easing of the burden of work for all. The profit motive, in conjunction with competition among capitalists, is responsible for an instability in the accumulation and utilization of capital, which leads to increasingly severe depressions. Unlimited competition leads to a huge waste of labor, and to that, crippling of the social consciousness of individuals. In systems of the past, people became hungry due to food shortages. Only under the system of production for profit do people become hungry because too much food exists. In systems of the past, people were homeless due to shortages of housing. But in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, spurred by the bursting of the housing bubble, millions of Americans lost their homes. Many even became homeless in a crisis caused by the fact that too much housing had been constructed, while the ability of the public to purchase it had vastly decreased. A famous dialogue between a recently unemployed Polish coal miner and his son, published in 1930, illustrates the problem of capitalist production. "Father, why don't we light the stove? I am cold." "We don't have coal, son." "And why haven't we got coal?" "Because there is too much coal." The problem of overproduction, or poverty amidst plenty, is a built-in failure of the capitalist system. It is something that endless efforts by capitalist governments, central bankers, fiat money printers, and others have never been able to resolve. As long as the means of production function simply as preliminary transformation into capital, growth will be restricted and cyclical crises will prevail. However, the situation currently facing the global economy is of a distinctly different character. Artificial intelligence has taken the automation of labor to a new level, unforeseen by Marx in 1867. In the modern era, the worker is not seeing his wages driven down by technology. Technology is not erasing a skilled trade or individual position here or there. Rather, the defining change of our time is that the worker is being eliminated from production and even from the service sector. In essence, the computer revolution is almost eliminating the working class. While Marx described workers in capitalism as being reduced from skilled craftsmen to being merely appendages to machines, in the 21st century, machines are being stripped of their appendages. As Jack Ma, Chinese Communist Party member and tech billionaire, said, "We made people like machines. Now we make machines like people." In the 21st century apparatus of production, workers are not needed. Assembly line factory workers are being relegated to history books. Computers that are now armed with artificial intelligence are better at trading stocks, printing books, and doing almost any manufacturing or service task. As U.S. presidential candidate Andrew Yang explained in an interview with the New York Times, "All you need is self-driving cars to destabilize society. We're going to have 1 million truck drivers out of work who are 94% male with an average level of education of high school or 1 year of college. That one innovation will be enough to create riots in the street. And we're about to do the same thing to retail workers, call center workers, fast food workers, insurance companies, accounting firms." The global apparatus of production, centered around Wall Street and London, churns out products more efficiently than ever before as millions and millions are cast out into poverty. Refugees pile into the United States from Latin America, from North America into Europe, and from Southeast Asia and the Pacific into the Middle East. The global reserve army of labor is growing and manifesting itself in a crisis of mass migration. The increasingly desperate masses of the global South manifest their poverty with the growth of terrorist groups and drug cartels. The Arab Spring of 2011 was effectively hijacked and controlled by Washington's covert efforts, but the anger and desperation underlying it has not disappeared. The problem is global, and the desperation is real. The greatest crisis of overproduction in the history of capitalism is now unfolding. The final conflict is upon us, and the Götterdämmerung is approaching for the Vandal gods of finance and empire. The means of production can no longer be allowed to function in an irrational way. The need for the centers of economic power to be controlled by society is no longer a matter of making human life easier, but a matter of preserving humanity itself. 1.2.8 The Unfolding Low-Wage Police State. The symptoms of societal deconstruction in the United States go far beyond the usual examples highlighted in international media, such as mass shootings, racial unrest, and political polarization. Across the United States, various municipalities are unpaving their roads. An article from Wired.com, published in June of 2016, describes the process in the state capital of Vermont, which is currently taking place in towns across the United States. Like many towns facing this recession, Montpelier has slashed its road budget. Meanwhile, several local bridges and retaining walls needed serious, urgent updates. Asphalt's pretty expensive, says Tom McCardle, the city's head of public works. By unpaving instead of repaving, Montpelier saved about $120,000, a big chunk for a city whose annual budget for street building and repairs was $1.3 million in 2009. Transportation agencies in at least 27 states have unpaved roads, according to a new report from the National Highway Cooperative Highway Research Program. They've done the bulk of that work in the past 5 years. Water purification is also lacking across the United States. The infamous Flint water crisis of Michigan was only the most sensational example, but in many parts of the country, drinking water is below sanitary standards. Power plants are crumbling, and public transportation systems are in disrepair. When New York City, the richest city on earth, was hit by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the result was the entire city shutting down, and a major power plant on the Lower East Side of Manhattan exploding. Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, was left without electricity for 11 months following a hurricane. As low-wage workers face the inevitability of being replaced by machines, their conditions become increasingly harsh. Howard Schultz, the billionaire owner of Starbucks, introduced his employees to slick innovation in exploitation known as clopenings, in which employees are forced to work back-to-back day-long shifts with no time to sleep in between. The New York Times described how computer programs are utilized to manage the lives of employees in order to make them as profitable as possible. Along with virtually every major retail and restaurant chain, Starbucks relies on software that choreographs workers in precise, intricate ballets, using sales patterns and other data to determine which of its 130,000 baristas are needed in its thousands of locations and exactly when. Big box retailers or mall clothing chains are now capable of bringing in more hands in anticipation of a delivery truck pulling in or the weather changing, and sending workers home when real-time analyses show sales are slowing. Managers are often compensated based on the efficiency of their staffing. But as miserable as the lives of food service and retail workers are becoming, they too are being phased out by technology. As Americans shop online, Main Street stores are closing down. The once buzzing suburban malls are fading into abandoned ghost towns. As wages stagnate and the overall living standard of the United States declines, debt is rising. In 2018, the total amount of household debt in the USA reached $13.54 trillion. Student debt, the bill young people run up in order to pay for their education, has reached $1.52 trillion. In June of 2018, Forbes magazine reported that over 44 million Americans have student debt, with the average amount owed being $38,390. An escalation of authoritarian tendencies from the military and policing agencies seems to be underway in the hopes of controlling an increasingly impoverished and desperate U.S. population. No-knock raids, in which police burst into the homes of people with guns drawn, are a rising trend. So are video-recorded instances of police summarily executing people in their custody. The Black Lives Matter protests highlighted the real outrage about increasing numbers of people dying at the hands of largely unaccountable police officers, in some cases recorded on film. While the African American community has been especially hard hit, the trend of extrajudicial killings by police officers has not been restricted to any particular demographic in U.S. society. The whole country faces a police state clampdown, accompanying a drop in living standards. Many working people in the United States find themselves stuck in a cycle of low-wage, short-term, service sector jobs. Surveillance culture and the understanding that phone calls and computer activities are being monitored seems to be a new reality as well. Instances of individuals being disappeared by the federal government without criminal charges are also on the rise. The Chicago police were caught operating a black site at Homan Square, where arrestees were disappeared for interrogation and torture before being taken to jail. An article from The Guardian, published in February 2015, describes the experience of one individual who was picked up and charged with terrorism and later acquitted in court. Brian Jacob Church was taken to Homan Square after police picked him up in 2012 on terrorism charges he beat at trial. He said police first photographed him for a biometrics database, took him down a long cinder block hallway on a second floor, and handcuffed him to a bench bolted to the floor. He spent the next 17 hours there, approximately, as it was a windowless room and the lights were kept on overhead, while police attempted an interrogation he described as a fishing expedition. The United States is, overall, dealing with a crisis of liberalism. The city-building tendency has been suppressed, and across all sectors, the vandal mindset has been unleashed. The standard of living is dropping, and basic societal functions become less routine. The rising police state is merely a symptom of an overall process of societal decay. 1.2.9 The Psychology and Politics of Deconstruction. The curse hanging over the United States is pessimism. A sense of dread, doom, and hopelessness seems to haunt all of society. The right wing spins horror stories of immigrant invasions, terrorists, and a politically correct authoritarianism. The left tells of the coming ecological catastrophe, fascist hate mobs, police brutality, gun violence, and unrestrained bigotry. As the US public becomes more politically engaged than ever before in recent years, almost every new political tendency presents a dark view of the future, a unique nightmare haunting its inheritance, spurring them to action through fear. Fear is a primitive instinct. It is the mindset of a mouse fleeing from a hungry cat or a rat leaping off a sinking ship. In states of fear and panic, people are subject to easy manipulation, and their ability to think rationally is reduced. Politics based on fear can easily produce chaos and submission, not rational construction. While economic decline is the primary basis for the crisis in U.S. society, the political landscape reacting to this situation has largely been shaped by cultural deconstruction. The political turmoil of 1968 to 1972 had a lasting impact on U.S. society. Opposition to the Vietnam War shook college campuses, and anti-racist rebellions took place across the urban centers. While U.S. society remained well intact, the underlying mythology on which the USA was built was largely blown to bits. For millions, the United States ceased to be a land of freedom and opportunity and was instead an imperialist country founded on genocide and slavery. The conservative strata, the silent majority first championed by Nixon and later by neocon Republicans, held on to the belief that the USA was a shining city on a hill and the greatest of all countries. Leo Strauss and Irving Kristol carefully crafted a message of "my country right or wrong" that won elections. Rupert Murdoch adopted it for cable news. For a significant time period, most of the white middle class kept believing in this American mythology, despite the realities that the rest of the world and big chunks of U.S. society had already observed. The religious right of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson promoted not just unquestioned belief in the Bible, but also unquestioned faith in the concept of America. This idea became much harder to hold on to in a world of free-flowing information. The Bush years marked the last hurrah, the final display of power from the silent majority. Amid the 2008 financial meltdown, conservatives gave up on love it or leave it. Libertarianism, paleoconservatism, and far-right populist concepts came to replace the mantra of "don't fix it if it ain't broke." The Trump presidency, with its talk of nationalism and the highlighting of voices such as Steve Bannon, signifies the conversion of the right wing and the death of the once effective neoconservative messaging style. Everyone in America seems to agree that the country is broke, yet most doubt that it can be fixed. The American political right seems to focus on the resentment of men against feminism or of whites who feel that the concerns of minorities are given too much attention while their plight is ignored. There is the belief that society's instability is the result of cultural Marxism or some left-wing conspiracy against an infallible free market. The white nationalist and alt-right movements have certainly received a large amount of attention in recent years. Their calls for a European ethno-state, amid attempts to rehabilitate the historical image of Adolf Hitler, remain largely fringe and irrelevant. The alt-right has become the favored boogeyman of a liberal establishment that sees Trump's pseudo-populist appeal as potentially dangerous. As capitalist societies enter crisis, Bonapartism is a natural outgrowth. Figures like Trump and Sanders, who seek to build a mass movement and suppress sections of the ruling class in the hopes of liquidating the crisis, are likely to become more and more prevalent. The anti-fascism of the Trump era very much follows in Susan Sontag's footsteps. the endless Russiagate mantra that Trump is an agent of Putin as he escalates the new Cold War almost mimics the conspiracy theories put forward by the John Birch Society during the 1960s. The broadcasts of Rachel Maddow portrayed Trump as dangerous because he questions U.S. foreign policy narratives. Trump's stirred up supporters are portrayed as a mass of uneducated rabble. Most of the organized left has been pathetically swept up into a mobilization by the establishment against Trump, where it functions as a virtually unnoticeable speck. Even beyond its relationship with the anti-populist mobilizations, the American left faces a strange moment of confusion. Socialism is now more popular than ever. Young Americans educated by professors who marched against the Vietnam War seem to agree that the USA is a country founded on racism and has engaged in genocidal wars. Talk of white privilege and gender oppression is everywhere and widely accepted by younger Americans. Yet the various Marxist-Leninist sects, most of which have been championing these messages since the 1970s, remain smaller and more irrelevant than ever. Among those who have recently adopted leftist sentiments, a desire to take action is noticeably absent. Wings of the political establishment looking to counter the right have poured money into attempted creations of a wider social democratic current. But this has happened reluctantly, despite even a nudge from powerful forces. The synthetic left, forged by the capitalist establishment, has stripped Marxism of all but its deconstructive aspect. With the essence of Marxism gone, leftism has degenerated, for some, into a youthful revenge fantasy of resentment, and for most, as merely a reason to feel hopeless, not a call to battle. While actual Marxism is about raising productive forces and allowing unlimited prosperity, the young socialists of today call to abolish billionaires in the hopes of depriving someone else of the material comfort they lack. Call-out culture has made it almost a moral imperative for young people to take offense and unload their resentments and aggression on each other. Sticking to Susan Sontag's anti-fascism, anything that reeks of fitness, courage, or political effectiveness is declared to be triggering. All individuals who can manage to be perceived as victims are held in high esteem. In essence, strength is viewed with suspicion, while weakness is celebrated. As one watches crowds of young postmodern liberals tear down Confederate monuments, it must be pointed out that they are not replacing them with statues of more honorable figures. The sentiment of the young leftists is that heroes and monuments themselves are the problem. Erecting any figure and movement of the past as an icon for reverence is totalitarian and fascist. Young leftists are not so different from the crowds mobilized to tear down statues of Lenin across Eastern Europe. As they carry out these acts of vandalism, they are hoping to protect Anne-Marie Slaughter's open international system from Trump's racism and pseudo-populism. Young leftists replace the racist mythology of the Confederacy with an international order that says individualism is the highest good and that collectivism is inherently totalitarian and dangerous. Beyond politics, the trends of pessimism and aspiring to be a victim have spread to the psychology of many American youth. As the traditional discipline, loyalty, and family obligation of U.S. society fades, the impulses and passions of younger Americans seem to be less restrained than ever. However, the meaning that once accompanied these passions of youth has been stripped away. The shallowness of pornography and casual hookups has replaced the beauty of romance. Accusing celebrities of racial insensitivity on social media has replaced the passion and solidarity felt by those who attended militant protests and actively promoted revolutionary ideology. A generation of young Americans seem to find themselves universally asking the question, who am I? What does my life mean? The United States political establishment once supplied answers to these questions. Those answers have been largely debunked. The synthetic left, spawned by sections of the ruling class itself, has effectively disproved America, capitalism, democracy, freedom, and all the myths that once held U.S. society together. However, true to its purpose, the synthetic left has not replaced these myths with any new purpose or ideology. The Atlanticist pathology, displayed in the demented culture that emerged along with the rise of British imperialism, has now manifested itself again in the United States. Dominance in global trade at the expense of overall development has fomented a society-wide episode of mass insanity. Young people stuck in cycles of short-term, low-wage jobs, living with and depending on their parents well into adulthood, are killing themselves at higher rates than the USA has seen in decades. Opioids are also claiming scores of lives. Alcohol-related deaths have also increased. The mental health industry has flourished with psychiatric medicine prescriptions higher than ever. Unlike the British Empire that seemed to fixate on caning children into obedience, the kinder and gentler society in the USA relegates children who misbehave in school to being diagnosed and prescribed pills. The misbehaving or non-conforming schoolchild, who was first diagnosed with ADD or ADHD and medicated as a preteen, soon finds themselves on antidepressants or antipsychotics as a teen. From there, they enter adulthood, condemned to a life of increasing dosages and switching medications. This occurs while whatever underlying tension or interpersonal difficulties was driving their original childhood nonconformity or disobedience is never addressed. The decaying culture and economy of the United States is causing a huge increase in mental health problems. Western society's primary vehicle for social and thought control in the 21st century seems to be social media. The users of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram find themselves almost constantly craving signs of affirmation from their peers. While history has long been made by bold individuals who stood firm in the face of opposition, social media reduces users to a level of interpersonal weakness. The need for more likes and shares drives a constant effort to conform and gain the approval of an ever-watching cyber audience. Unlike George Orwell's dystopia, it is not government officials watching over us, monitoring our lives in order to punish any sign of nonconformity. Rather, we watch over each other, granting the carrot of peer approval that we have learned to desperately crave, and we obediently conform in order to receive. In addition to pushing conformity, social media has tragically become a vehicle for many young Americans who seem to crave sympathy. Being successful or displaying strength is often considered triggering, offensive, and fascist by the synthetic left. Social media presents young people with the ability to display their weaknesses to the world, granting themselves the celebrated status of victimhood. In February of 2019, Instagram finally banned all images of self-mutilation after a long-standing trend of teenagers and young adults cutting themselves and posting the photographs for attention. While the British Empire unleashed the horror of serial killers, the staple criminal pathology of declining American capitalism seems to be the mass shooter. Young white men who are attracted to racial supremacism and who tend to have antisocial personalities decide to end their lives in an orgy of death. They kill their classmates and often random groups of strangers in a hail of bullets. This is an explosion of long internalized rage. The young mass murderers hope to be immortalized as news reporters summarize their manifestos on the airwaves and their life story is uploaded to Wikipedia. Underlying the crisis facing Western youth seems to be a horrific knowledge that cannot be escaped. Capitalism is a system where most human beings can only survive by selling their labor power. The result of automation and the computer revolution has been this system declaring millions of people, even within the most prosperous centers of Western capitalism, to be expendable and useless. The youth who kill or mutilate themselves, numb their pain with drugs, or wallow in other pessimistic escapes, all seem to be moaning, "I am capable of something better than this. I have something to offer the world, but my society has refused to utilize me." Human beings are collective creatures by nature. Even before civilization's dawn, we were tribal. Wanting to be part of something bigger than yourself and your own pleasure, being willing to sacrifice and work hard for a vision of improving the world around you. This is a natural, normal state of being. It is this very drive toward collective action and creativity that defines human beings and separates us from animals. However, the Vandal mindset, spawned by excessive deconstruction and the liberal fixation on individualism, has robbed millions of people of fulfilling this basic human desire. As a result, Western societies spiral into a greater state of instability amid economic decline. One can contrast the suicidal, hopeless generation of Western youth who are full of potential that is seemingly unwanted by society with the youth of the Bolivarian countries, China, Iran, or Russia. Western media portrays the Bolivarian youth collectives, the young pioneers of China and Cuba, and Russia's Nazi summer camps as ruthlessly totalitarian. According to Western media, nothing is worse than these youth programs, where impressionable young people are being brainwashed and indoctrinated by a regime that is using them. But yet, one must be forced to ask, is it better for young people to be free while stripped of any identity or purpose? Is it better to be cast into a state of permanent confusion than to be mobilized to build a better society for your country folk? Is a society that deems the next generation as useless because no profits can be made from their labor really superior and free? When compared to a system that views each citizen as an asset to be unleashed in order to build and to advance historical progress? One point two point ten, the potential for American rebirth. The presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders, the elderly Vermont senator who calls himself a democratic socialist, attracted a huge following among younger Americans. His message would seem quite normal for a politician in any other corner of the world, but to many Americans it is unique and bold. Sanders speaks to sold-out crowds of disproportionately young Americans bemoaning the crimes of the billionaire class. As he has explained, democratic socialism means that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy. Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system in America today, which is not only grossly unfair, but in many respects corrupt. Sanders' message is miles away from Marxism. Sanders calls simply for European-style welfare state reforms. He advocates free healthcare, free education, higher taxes on the wealthy, and better protections for workers on the job. However, this left-wing populism and class struggle rhetoric is new to American politics. The synthetic left moved away from such rhetoric long ago in favor of its pessimistic privilege politics and individualist anti-fascism. The right wing and center have long maintained unregulated capitalism as an ideal. The importance of the Bernie Sanders movement is not found in what it advocates, but rather in the conversation it creates. Rather than speaking of a more perfect union or one America, as Obama and other liberals have long done, Sanders has reintroduced the seemingly forgotten notion of class against class. He has identified the wealthiest people, the owners of the major centers of economic power, as having interests that are contrary to the rest of the country. This notion that he presents is the inescapable truth. The United States has become deindustrialized and faces internal decay and impoverishment. Meanwhile, the Wall Street and London monopolists have enriched themselves like never before. They are loyal, not to the country and the betterment of its population, but rather to their own profits, rooted in a global financial system. The slogan that is most encouraging among the Sanders movement is, "Not me, us." The slogan calls for unleashing some notion of a group or collectivist identity and joint effort. This message is particularly valuable in a society where the glorification of capitalism from the right wing and the fixation with deconstruction from the synthetic left has eroded such essential sentiments. As Sanders crowds chant, "Not me, us," they are questioning the basic premise of liberalism, that individualism must be prioritized above all else. The Sanders movement calls for more social programs and redistribution of wealth. Thus, it has made itself a target of widespread right-wing criticism. Rightists portray the Sanders movement as simply representing Rightists portray the Sanders movement as simply representing entitlement from a generation that is deemed lazy and unproductive. What would make the Sanders movement explosively powerful is if the sentiment of "not me, us" could be harnessed into an energy for mass construction and mobilization to rebuild the country. The power of the Sanders movement, or elements like it, could be almost unstoppable. That would require going beyond simply calling for expanding social benefits and instead toward calls for a state-directed rebirth of the economy. The current pessimism is not coming from within the American people, but is imposed on them by a dying social system. The oil monopolists, who fear new energy sources, see historical progress as a bad thing. Behind their talk of overpopulation, free markets, and the need for an open international system is the real fear that the means of production and the world itself could slip away from them. History must be stopped in order to indefinitely extend their rule. When one observes the youthful crowds rallying around Sanders, one can see that the potential for the city-building tendency to reawaken itself on American shores is very real. the human energy seeking to build, create, and forge societal unity that is very well alive in Eurasia certainly exists within the American psyche. It has for a long time. Though the propagandists of American capitalism have tried to bury it, the U.S. working class has a history of revolutionary activism and solidarity. Anti-slavery fanatic John Brown led his famous raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Despite all the evils of settler colonialism and racism, the United States has long been identified around the world with a kind of pioneer desire to innovate and construct. It has only been the unique 21st century incarnation of the Atlanticist pathology that has eroded the motor mindedness long identified with American culture. The spark of inner drive and a desire to go out and do something has not vanished within the American people. The classically American go get 'em live wire mentality must be channeled into a collectivist endeavor for the country to be completely reborn on new, progressive, and revolutionary foundations. The model of win-win cooperation advanced by China and its Belt and Road Initiative is the perfect answer to the Atlanticist pathology. Connecting the world through trade and mutual development projects spells the end of countries being reduced to captive markets and spheres of influence. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America, and other joint development operations centered around socialist countries are more effective in creating a new world and smashing the old order than any other weapon. These projects, seeking to restructure the global economy in a way that eliminates poverty, are the only realistic solution to the crisis of mass migration to Western countries. The way to end the rise of terrorist groups and drug cartels is to shatter the old financial order based on holding back progress. Already we have seen the successes of the Eurasian alternative. Within even the most underdeveloped, corrupt, and politically weak societies, they bring the most constructive and progressive elements forward. The future of the United States ultimately mandates bringing the country into such efforts as much as possible. The more elements of the U.S. economy that can be integrated into the Eurasian alternative, the greater potential will exist for the city-building tendency within the United States itself. Trump's calls for economic nationalism have turned into the opposite. Trump's tariffs are nothing more than leading the charge of Wall Street and London to barricade and block off China, a rising source of wealth and development that challenges their decaying system. Just as Julius Caesar emerged to champion the tradition of Socrates, Confucius, and Gilgamesh amid the plunder-based Roman Empire, forces that seek to build and not destroy will emerge within the United States. Such forces will see Russia, China, the Bolivarian countries, Iran, and other independent nations as potential allies rather than enemies or rivals. An axis within U.S. society that pushes for the rebirth of the country with central planning and integrating it into the Eurasian alternative must be built. As the factions within the ruling class of the United States pick constituencies among the population and mobilize them to attack each other, the city building tendency must not join such efforts. The myth that one section of the American working class can gain only at the expense of another must be debunked. The crisis of U.S. society cannot be cured by punishing or deranking one section of society in order to embolden and strengthen another. Such efforts to whipsaw the population are the basis of fascism and reactionary Bonapartism. The crisis will not be solved with downgrading or shaming those working families deemed to be historically privileged, or with enhancing the boot heels of repression used against those who have long been marginalized. A line of march for leading all the people of the United States out of poverty and towards something better must be put forward. All of society must be mobilized against the monopolists and the Atlanticist pathology. To envision the city-building tendency taking power in the United States is to imagine the following. Imagine a government that immediately hired those unemployed or underutilized young people and put them to work rebuilding the country. A generation of highly skilled young people would no longer be wasted in the low-wage, short-term jobs of the vanishing service sector. Rather, they would be unleashed to build new schools and universities, high-speed rail systems, fuel-efficient energy sources, water treatment plants, public health facilities, and other badly needed infrastructure. Gainful employment, doing useful work, should be considered both a right and an obligation of all citizens. A spirit of selflessness and patriotism must be promoted as a generation is put to work rebuilding the parts of the country that have fallen into decay. Imagine a government that seized control of the natural resources such as oil, gas, timber, and coal, and declared that they were the property of every person in the country. The public budget should be refilled with the revenue created by America's vast natural wealth. The proceeds should be spent in order to build a better life for the population, not to line the pockets of the rich. Imagine a government that seized control of banking and put the lending and printing of money into the hands of the state, not the Federal Reserve Bank or the private houses of finance. The state could directly oversee an overall recreation of U.S. society. This could be achieved with control over the purse strings of the nation and a 5-year economic plan drawn up by a brain trust of the greatest engineers and scientists. The state would finance great construction projects to make life and business easier for everyone in U.S. society. The state would lend money to young people to become entrepreneurs and start new high-tech firms. The state would provide startup funding for worker cooperatives. The market would be allowed to flourish with rational leaders centrally planning it and preventing the irrational greed of a few from destroying the hopes of the many. Imagine a government that treated every American citizen as being worthy of a decent life. Roosevelt's vision of an economic Bill of Rights, securing the right to housing, education, employment, and other basic needs, would be easily attained in the context of the state controlling the centers of economic power. A revolutionary government would work to secure a decent life for everyone in the country. During the Cold War years, the Wall Street monopolists favored and backed authoritarian governments across the world to suppress the threat of communist revolution. However, in the new age of globalism and neoliberalism, the wreckers and vandals of international finance prefer weak, ineffective governments that merely set back as the agenda of impoverishment unfolds. Just as a parent who let their child go hungry or freeze in the cold would be charged with a crime, the government of the United States is guilty of criminal neglect. Rather than champion the people's interests against the forces of destruction, the government has allowed the predatory forces of monopolism to prey on the American people. With its hands-off neoliberal ideology, the political class of the United States has allowed the very people it is chartered to serve to be left destitute, hungry, and often feeling hopeless. The curing of this overall state of societal decay can only come in the form of a government of action. A government of action would be one rooted in the understanding that it is the obligation of the state to improve living conditions and advance historical progress. The liberal notion that the government is best which governs least must be shattered. It needs to be replaced with the conceptions of statecraft that built every great civilization and pioneered every great advance for the human species. Socialism will come to the United States in a unique form that will be unlike anything seen in the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Venezuela, or anywhere else. Only the American people themselves are capable of rescuing the country from capitalism. Only a kind of socialism rooted in their own desires and hopes, intended to address their own problems and hardships, will ever be capable of rebuilding the United States. Socialism cannot and will not be the result of foreign subversion or a hostile takeover by geopolitical rivals. American socialism will be the result of a homegrown upsurge of patriotism and internationalism. Just as the socialism that has allowed China to be reborn is labeled socialism with Chinese characteristics, it will be a socialism with American characteristics that rescues the United States from decline and societal decay. A call must go out to those Americans whose will not just to live and survive, but to construct and create is so strong that they cannot sit back any longer. Those who see the current situation as intolerable must begin the process of completely changing American politics. For those who were like Socrates, Caesar, Copernicus, Lenin, and so many others, and who would seek to continue the city-building tradition in times of darkness, the moment of truth is now upon us. Those individuals who seek to push civilization toward a higher state of being, driven by an inner flame of creativity and boldness, must now reveal themselves. Time is running out. Oh. All right. I choked out those last few words. I needed a drink. Oh, I should stop this probably. Okay. All right. I need to see in the book here if these are all just questions, study group questions. Pick him up. I was going to do an hour, but I think... Oh, no, this is good. I'll read the rest of these questions and we'll end this video. Let's do... All right. Here we go. Let me fix this real quick. Okay, hang on. Edit. Split at playhead. Edit. Split at playhead. There we go. Let's see if that's good. Okay. Delete. Record just a little bit of room noise. Time is running out. Okay, that should be good. Perfect. All right. Starting back up right here. Questions for study and group discussion. Hit record. Questions for study and group discussion. Who are the vandals of today? Who are the city builders? Is primitivism right wing or left wing? Why? Is innovation a necessary part of leftism? If so, how can we nurture it? 1.1.1 The Legacy of Gilgamesh, Confucius, and Socrates. How do we change our environment to suit us? How can we learn from ancient legends and myths? What would be a progressive myth today? What would be a reactionary myth? 1.1.2 The Death of Julius Caesar. Was there an American Julius Caesar? Are there modern forms of Stoicism and hedonism? If so, what are they? Are there any other populist, non socialist leaders that we can learn from? If so, who? 1.1.3 Vandals bring on the Dark Ages. Is America the new Roman Empire? Why is democracy dangerous for the owning class? Why did the Roman Empire fall at roughly the same time that it embraced Christianity? Was Christianity a progressive force or reactionary force in the Roman Empire? 1.1.4 A New Order Forged by Revolutionaries. Does Thomas Malthus' theory of overpopulation play a role today in politics? If so, how so? Why does development like the Silk Road spark progressive change? Does scientific discovery influence revolutionary ideas? What role did secret societies play in overturning feudalism? Why? 1.1.5 The Emergence of Scientific Socialism. Are there utopian socialists today? If so, what distinguishes us from them? Following in the footsteps of Marx, how do we analyze movements, uprisings, and revolutions today? How does the anarchy of production cause problems for us in modern day? Could this be fixed by having a planned economy? 1.1.6 Imperialism and the Crisis of Marxism. What American socialist influences you the most? Can we learn anything from Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward? Is it a good tactic to follow in Eugene Debs' footsteps and tour the country preaching socialism? How does imperialism keep the developing world poor? How has the process of stratifying the working class continued? What is the current situation facing the aristocracy of labor in the USA and other Western countries? 1.1.7 The Atlanticist Pathology, a Mindset from Hell. What are some of the Atlanticist pathology mindsets in the world today? What role does Britain play in contemporary geopolitics? How can we combat manifestations of the Atlanticist pathology within ourselves? Why have serial killers declined in recent decades, despite incidents of mass murder and shootings rising? What has changed in our culture? How is the Atlanticist pathology similar to the mindset cultivated by the Roman Empire? How is it different? 1.1.8 The Party of New Type. Does democratic centralism work for the American context? Why or why not? Why have socialist revolutions only happened in developing countries so far? What challenges are there for revolutionaries and imperialist nations? How do we overcome those challenges? Are Soviets or worker councils a good way of organizing neighborhoods? If so, how do we build them? What were Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin's mistakes? What were their successes? 1.1.9 Socialist Construction and the Rise of Eurasia. How do we combat the myth that socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried? Why has the record of the Soviet Union's achievements been covered up? What would our 5-year plan for socialist construction be for America? What would be the differences in socialism in a developing nation versus a developed nation? 1.1.10 Victories for all humanity. What cultural institutions are ignored because of American capitalism? What could socialists do to fix this? How does capitalism feed racial prejudice? What would socialism need to do in America to combat racial prejudice? What can we learn from the Cold War and the manipulation of Bonapartist regimes by presidents like the Kennedys or liberal wings of American capitalism? What caused the post-war economic expansion? What caused the rise of European social democratic welfare states? 1.2.1 Revolutionary intelligentsia and the broad masses. Who are the revolutionary intelligentsia today? Who are the broad masses? Which do you identify with more? Why? What would be a good revolutionary slogan like peace, land, and bread for the American context? Would a socialist democracy in America be any different than a capitalist democracy? If so, how so? Why were the free breakfast and free healthcare programs created by the Black Panther Party so successful? How can we set up community programs like this ourselves? 1.2.2 The Synthetic Left. What is authoritarianism? What is freedom? Is freedom dependent upon stability and development? Why or why not? Who is synthetic leftism? Who can we win from the synthetic left? How do we clear up the distortions created by the synthetic left? How can we prevent manipulation of the left from happening again? How do we fight against addiction and Malthusian thinking in our communities? 1.2.3 Susan Sontag's redefinition of fascism. How can we push back against the war machine when it is justified through progressive language? Why is Susan Sontag's definition of fascism incorrect? What is the actual definition of fascism? What is the difference between communism and fascism? Does fascism have anything in common with liberalism? Is liberalism authoritarian? Why or why not? What is totalitarianism? Why was the term created? 1.2.4 The rise of the color revolutions. Can we learn anything from liberal geopolitical strategists like Zbigniew Brzezinski? Are the tactics used in the color revolutions of Eastern Europe currently being used in the United States? What was the result of restoring capitalism in Eastern Europe? Have the shock therapy economics of the 1990s been used in other times? How must revolutionary aesthetics and messaging be adjusted in light of the late Cold War? 1.2.5 China's Great Adjustment. What can we learn from China's rise, the Sino Soviet split, the Gang of Four period, and the Deng Xiaoping reforms? What is the role of intellectuals in a socialist society? Why does communism require vast material abundance? Can society reach a higher stage in conditions of poverty? How do we fight corruption in the socialist movement? How can America get off of fossil fuels? What would a socialist American foreign policy be? 1.2.6 The nature of socialism in the 21st century. What is anti-imperialism? Can you be an anti-imperialist and still be patriotic? How is 21st century socialism different from the socialism of the Cold War? What is the difference between 21st century socialism and social democracy? Is economic development an important part of socialism? Why or why not? How do we build solidarity, courage, and a all for one and one for all attitude? 1.2.7 The pending Gotterdammerung. Is capitalism's instability an argument against it? If so, how would you highlight this problem to average Americans? What is the solution to overproduction or poverty amidst plenty? What does the computer revolution mean for the socialist movement? 1.2.8 The unfolding low-wage police state. What should be the strategy to combat the low-wage police state? How do we defend our communities from police terrorism? Would combating our addiction and reliance on modern technology be a good strategy to stop surveillance culture? 1.2.9 The psychology and politics of deconstruction. How do we combat fear and pessimism in America? Who are we? What does our life mean? Do your answers to these questions influence your politics? If so, how? How can we combat social media's influence over us? Why should the youth fight for socialism? 1.2.10 The potential for American rebirth. How do we learn from the Bernie Sanders movement? What were the successes? The failures? How do we nurture innovation and motor-mindedness? How do we rekindle the American revolutionary spirit? How do we rekindle the American revolutionary spirit? What would an American rebirth mean for you? Okay, so that's where we'll start on our next one, the chapter 2, book 2, The Case for Socialism. All right, put me back up here. If you guys want to support, you can buy a copy of the book. It's in the description. My Patreon, Caleb's Patreon are both in the description. And most importantly, a link to join us at CPI. We're doing a book study tonight. I was hoping to do another chapter. I'm not quite sure if I'll make it because our meeting starts very shortly. But yeah, join CPI and you can study that book with us. I love all you guys. God bless. Good night. Viva la revolution. See you on the next one.